the Ottoman Empire's secret machinery of control, and how it destroyed itself from within. The boy was 7 years old when he watched his father die. He didn't cry. He had been trained not to. And 3 hours later, he sat on the throne of the most powerful empire on earth. But that's not where this story begins. Most empires collapse because enemies breach the walls. The Ottoman Empire lasted 6 centuries. It built the most sophisticated legal system of the medieval world. Its courts were so trusted that Christian merchants and Jewish scholars crossed borders specifically to use them because Ottoman judges were considered fairer than their own. And yet, this same civilization, with those same courts, those same written codes, those same legal scholars, built something else alongside all of it. Something that never appeared in the legal texts. Something so embedded in the system's architecture that it didn't need to. The empire didn't fall because of foreign enemies. It was eaten from the inside by the very mechanisms designed to protect it. And the most terrifying part? Asterisk trap was built on purpose. Imagine you are walking through Istanbul in 1550. You are a cloth merchant. Early morning. The market is already loud. The smell of bread, animals, smoke. You turn a corner, and there, at eye level, is a human head mounted on an iron spike at the city gate. It faces outward, toward you, deliberately. Next to it, two severed hands nailed flat to the wood, fingers still slightly curled. You don't stop. You don't ask questions, because you already understand the message. This was not chaos. This was not the aftermath of war spilling into the streets. This was asterisk policy. Someone in an office, a judge, a vizier, a palace official, had signed a document. That document had been executed with procedural efficiency, and the result had been placed here, at this specific gate, at this specific height, to be seen by the maximum number of people before noon. The Ottoman state didn't rule only through laws. It ruled through what it made you remember. They had a word for it in the administrative texts. Bread. It means roughly edification by example. When officials ordered a public execution, the documentation sometimes noted explicitly, not as a side effect, not as an addendum, but as the asterisk primary purpose, that it was done for the benefit of those watching. The punishment was not the end of the process, that it was done for the benefit of those watching. The punishment was not the end of the process. Ask, the watching was. But here is what no one asks. If the courts were genuinely fair, and the historical record suggests they often were, why did a civilization capable of legal nuance also need to leave a man's hands nailed to a gate until they rotted? The answer doesn't live in the courts. It lives in the palace. Topkapi, palace, was not just a residence. It was a city, a machine, a political solar system, and everything orbited the sultan. Poets competed for court positions. Astronomers calculated the heavens from its towers. And in the chambers of the inner palace, young boys, the sultan's own sons, waited every single day for news that would determine whether they lived or died. Because the Ottoman succession had no fixed rule, any son of the sultan could claim the throne. And that single fact had produced something worse than war. It had produced asterisk cycles of collapse. Brothers raised armies. Provinces fractured. Borders softened. Enemies recognized the window and moved through it. Mehmed II, the man who had taken Constantinople at 21, understood this with the same mathematical precision he brought to siege warfare. A fortress could be breached by cannon. An empire could be breached by inheritance. So he wrote a law that no ruler before him had been willing to put in writing. Whichever of his sons inherited the throne was legally permitted, asterisk encouraged, to have his brothers killed, not as punishment, not for any crime committed, simply for existing. Asterisk, the justification was a single sentence. The order of the world requires it. For decades it worked. Perfectly. Surgically. Terrifyingly well. Successions that would have shattered into civil war were resolved in a single night. The empire held its borders. Campaigns continued uninterrupted. From the outside, the system looked like asterisk stability. From the inside, it looked like a countdown. Because every prince inside Topkapian was now simultaneously a potential sultan and a potential corpse, and the distance between those two outcomes depended entirely on which of his brothers reached the executioners first. Think about what that does to a child raised inside those walls, not as an abstract political question, but as a psychological one. What kind of man does that produce? His father Murad had left behind an empire showing strain at every seam. Persian pressure from the east, Habsburg resistance in the west, the treasury stretched, the military exhausted. And inside the palace, asterisk 19 brothers. Asterisk, the oldest was in his mid-teens. Several were still infants. The order was given within days of Mehmed's accession. All 19 were to be executed. Royal blood could not touch the ground, so they were strangled, each one individually. With a silk cord, the bodies were wrapped before the official mourning period for the previous sultan had ended. The court observed both events simultaneously. Grief for the father, silence about the sons. If the mothers of the executed princes were not punished, they were loaded onto a boat within the week and transported across the city to the old palace, where retired concubines lived out the remainder of their lives in managed obscurity. They arrived carrying nothing. They would never return. This was not cruelty. This was procedure. And it is exactly that coldness, the procedural efficiency of it, that reveals something about the system that the scale of the fratricide almost distracts you from noticing. Because while everyone watched the 19 brothers, the silk cords, the infants, something else had been building inside that palace for decades. Something the men who wrote those laws had never once considered a threat. European visitors who came back with stories of the Ottoman harem told their audiences what those audiences wanted to hear: veiled women in forbidden rooms, gilded captivity, oriental fantasy. What the harem actually was, functionally, structurally, politically, was the operational nerve center of the most powerful empire on earth. And, by 1550, it was controlled by one woman. Hasquitampu. Her name was Hurrem. She arrived at Topkapi as a slave, a raid on a Ruthenian village sometime in the 1500s. No family, no allies, no inheritance. Nothing the Ottoman system recognized as power. Within 15 years, she had rewritten what power meant. Hurrem became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, the first concubine in Ottoman history to receive that status. She moved out of the harem into apartments adjacent to the Sultan's own quarters, breaking 2 centuries of protocol in a single relocation. She conducted her own foreign correspondence. Polish ambassadors wrote to her directly. She wrote back in her own name. In a system where women held no official position, where they were structurally invisible, how does a Ruthenian slave girl end up with a foreign policy portfolio? By making herself indispensable to the one person in the empire whose power was absolute. And then she did something that even historians who study her closely still find difficult to fully explain. She removed every rival who stood between her sons and the throne. Not quickly, not obviously. Over 30 years, one move at a time. Ibrahim Pasha, Grand Vizier, Suleiman's closest companion for 15 years. He had commanded armies, negotiated treaties, been present at every significant imperial decision for a decade and a half. Foreign visitors called him untouchable. In 1536, he was strangled in his sleep inside the palace. Ottoman records note only that the relationship between Ibrahim and had been openly hostile for years, and that Suleiman signed the order. Desad Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by another woman, by every surviving account, the most capable of Suleiman's sons. Experienced in administration, popular with the Janissaries. The army wanted him, the provinces respected him. He was the obvious successor. Everyone knew it. Which meant, for Hurrem, he was the single most dangerous person alive. Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his campaign tent. The charge was never formally recorded, something involving contact with the Safavid enemy, a whisper of treason. Enough to justify a summons, not enough to require evidence. Mustafa arrived at his father's tent. He walked inside. The executioners were already waiting. He was strangled with a bowstring. The Janissary units that had served under Mustafa wept openly in the camp. Several refused orders for days. A revolt broke out in Anatolia, led by a man who claimed to be Mustafa's ghost, speaking to the villages that had been counting on him. Hurrem had died 2 years before Mustafa's execution, which means the machinery she built kept running after she was gone. Her son eventually took the throne. The historians who came after called him Salim the Sot, a Saks. The woman who maneuvered him there left no official record of having done any of it. Is that an accident, or is that the point? The fratricide law had produced a problem its author hadn't fully calculated. Every execution was a scandal. Every strangled infant was a story that spread beyond the palace gates. By the early 17th century, the optics were becoming impossible to manage, so the empire invented something it called a mercy, the asterisk Kafes, the cage. Instead of executing princes, they would be confined, housed inside sealed apartments within the palace complex, supervised constantly, cut off from the outside world. No governance, no military training, no contact with political life. Ask the theory. Contain the threat without creating the spectacle of fratricide. Ask the reality. Ask produce rulers who had been psychologically dismantled before they ever reached the throne. And no one would pay that price more completely than Ibrahim I. Ibrahim had watched his brother Murad, from inside this room, order the execution of two other brothers during his reign. He had spent 22 years conditioning himself to interpret every approaching footstep as potentially his last. When palace officials came to tell him Murad was dead, that the throne was his, Ibrahim barricaded himself inside. He believed it was a trap. He refused to come out until his mother came to the door herself, spoke through the wood at length, begged, argued. Eventually, Asteris forced it open. This was the man the empire now required to govern 25 million people across 3 continents. He had never governed a city. He had never commanded a unit. He had spent the entirety of his adult life in a sealed room, learning only how to survive in a sealed room. And we wonder how empires fall, but Ibrahim wasn't the only product of this system. He was just the most visible. The fratricide law had been written by men who assumed power moved in one direction, downward from the sultan, through his viziers, through the military to the provinces. Ast, they had not considered upward. Ast, built to contain princes, had also confined their mothers alongside them, which meant that when a prince finally emerged to rule, the only person in the empire he trusted without reservation was the woman who had shared that sealed room with him. That trust was a lever, and one woman understood its mechanics better than anyone who had ever lived inside that palace. She arrived at Topkapi around 1604, Greek by origin. Like her, she had nothing when she arrived. No inherited position, no political connections, nothing the Khanan recognized as power. Within a decade, she was running the empire. Asterisk, she became regent twice, for 2 different sultans. She removed grand viziers with the same procedural efficiency the Khanan applied to princes. She managed the treasury during military crises that would have paralyzed a less experienced administrator. Foreign ambassadors who wanted access to the Ottoman court learned quickly. The most direct route ran asterisk through her. She was, by any functional measure, the ruler of the empire for significant stretches of the early 17th century. And none of that appears in the official records. The chronicles list her as a builder of mosques, a funder of soup kitchens, a patron of charitable foundations. The political architecture she built over 40 years appears in the records only as its outcomes, the deaths recorded, the official reasons given. The corridor between the two left deliberately blank. Her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, had been waiting. For years, foreign ambassadors had tracked the tension between the two women. Courtiers had quietly begun signaling which side they would stand on when the moment came. The moment had a shape now. Everyone inside the palace could feel it. Kosem was found hidden behind a curtain in her apartments. She was strangled. Some accounts say she fought. The chronicles record it in language that is brief and procedural, the same register they used for everything that was not supposed to have happened. The woman who had effectively governed the most powerful empire on earth for decades, who had survived 4 decades of court intrigue, who had ordered the deposition of her own son, died the same way the 19 brothers died, with a cord around her throat. In the same palace. Askerist, using the same method. Askerist, the empire's most powerful informal ruler, had been killed by the empire's own most efficient informal weapon. And the next day the business of governance continued without interruption. The Janissary Corps had been the empire's most brilliant institutional invention. Taken young through the Devshmer, the periodic levy of Christian boys from Balkan provinces, they were converted, trained, and absorbed into an elite military unit that owed everything to the Ottoman state and nothing to any external loyalty. No fathers to avenge, no lands to protect, no interests except the Sultan's interests. That was the theory. Asterisk, By the 17th century, the theory had been dead for 100 years. Janissaries owned shops in the bazaar. They had guild connections. Their sons joined their units automatically, bypassing the Davishmir entirely. They had become, over the course of a century and a half, exactly what the system had been built to prevent. A self-perpetuating institution, with inherited loyalties, economic interests, and the military capacity to determine who sat on the throne. What do you do when the soldiers who are supposed to enforce the law, become the law? He had seen what the Janissaries had become. He had moved too directly, too quickly, with too little groundwork to dismantle their accumulated privileges. He had been recruiting Anatolian and Syrian troops as an alternative military base. The Janissaries recognized the pattern. The Janissaries seized him before he could leave the capital. They dragged him through the streets, the Sultan, the absolute ruler, the man who embodied the Ottoman state, through the streets to the Yedikul fortress. What happened to him inside those walls was not quick. The method was chosen deliberately, designed to invert, specifically, the humiliation Osman had intended for the core. He was 19 years old. Hastan, Mr. Caesar Mustafa I, had already been deposed once before Osman's reign. He was retrieved from the Kafes to fill the vacancy the Janissaries had created. He lasted less than a year before being removed again. The official chronicles struggled to maintain the fiction that any of this had been orderly. What it demonstrated was something the fratricide law had never once anticipated, that the mechanism for removing a sultan didn't require legal apparatus. It required soldiers willing to act, and a court that had learned over generations to absorb the fact of violence without publicly registering its cause. Ibrahim's behavior had become increasingly disconnected from administrative reality. His decisions, when he made them directly, were unpredictable in ways the court could no longer absorb. His appointments reflected personal caprice rather than political calculation. The factions multiplied, the treasury strained, the military lost confidence. And then, in a moment that contains everything wrong with the system in a single image, his mother signed the order. Qasim Sultan, the woman who had governed the empire as regent, who had outmaneuvered rivals across 4 decades, who would herself be strangled 3 years later, determined that her own son had become a liability the system could no longer sustain. The Thehul Islam issued a fatwa. Ibrahim was deposed. He was 33 years old. His 7-year-old son replaced him on the throne that same afternoon. Ibrahim would be killed 10 days later. The method: the silk cord. The same cord that had been used on the brothers, on the princes, on the mothers who outlived their usefulness. The system consuming itself, precisely as it had been designed to. It was the second attempt. The first had failed in 1529 under Suleiman himself. If this one succeeded, the Ottoman reach into the European heartland would be permanent. The siege ran through the summer. The city held. In September, a relief force arrived. Polish cavalry under Jan Sobieski, coordinated with Austrian and German infantry. The Ottoman lines broke in an engagement that lasted a single afternoon. The army retreated south. The Sultan commanding this campaign, Hastrush Menedvith, had been 7 years old when he watched his father deposed and killed. He had spent his formative years on the throne managed by his grandmother, the woman who had ordered his father's death. He had grown into an adult who preferred hunting to administration. He had been shaped, completely and permanently, by a system that built rulers through isolation, confinement, and managed proximity to violence. The army at Vienna was not defeated by Polish cavalry. It was defeated by a century of structural decisions that had been made inside sealed rooms in Istanbul. The Janissaries were finally, violently, abolished. The event was called, with the careful bureaucratic distance the Ottoman state had always applied to things that were not supposed to have happened, auspicious, the auspicious incident. Auspicious. Thousands of Janissaries were killed in a single day, their barracks burned, their records destroyed. The core that had defined Ottoman military power for 5 centuries was eliminated in an afternoon. The last sultan was removed in 1922, the caliphate abolished in 1924, and the institution Mehmed II had built around absolute, legally encoded, uncontestable power ended, not with a siege, not with a foreign army at the gate, with a vote in a newly formed parliament. No silk cord. No executioners. No crowd in a public square. Asked, just a vote. What the Ottoman system had constructed across 5 centuries was not undone by any single failure. It was undone by the accumulated weight of every mechanism designed to make it permanent. The fratricide law produced men raised in sealed rooms who had never once governed anything. The Kafes produced rulers whose entire psychology had been shaped by captivity and the proximity of death. The harem that was supposed to be invisible became the nerve center of the state. The janissaries who were supposed to enforce the sultan's will eventually decided whose will would be enforced. The chronicles that were supposed to record the empire's glory left deliberate blank spaces where the actual decisions had been made, the decisions that determined the fate of 25 million people. Every instrument of control had, over time through simple structural logic, become its own form of instability, not through corruption, not through conspiracy, not through any foreign pressure, through the inescapable consequence of what happens when a system is built to prevent challenge from every direction, except the one it never thought to look. As here is the question that the Ottoman example forces us to ask about every powerful system we live inside today. What is the one direction it isn't looking? If this channel gave you something textbooks never did, a version of history that doesn't sanitize the machinery, that follows the power where it actually moved, that doesn't sanitize the machinery that follows the power where it actually moved. Like this video. It signals to the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it keeps us building more of it. Subscribe to the Historian Fact Disc, and turn on notifications, because the next investigation is already in progress, and it goes somewhere most channels still won't follow. The blank corridors of history are exactly where we work.